Let's begin. On behalf of the program in Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law, it is my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to talk by Geoffrey Brennan. Jeff holds appointments as Distinguished Research Professor in the Politics Department at Duke University, Distinguished Research Professor in the Philosophy Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Professor of Economics in the Social and Political Theory Group at the Research School of Social Sciences at the Australian National University. Can you put that all on one business card? From our perspective, however, perhaps Jeff's most important title is Director of the joint Duke UNC Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, which, as many of us have been talking, has served as an important model for the development of the new PPEL program here at the University of Richmond. Like our other speakers this semester, Jeff works at the intersection of economics, political philosophy, and rational choice theory. He is the author or co-author of 9 books, including The Reason of Rules, Constitutional Political Economy, Democracy and Decision, The Pure Theory of Electoral Preference, and The Economy of Esteem. Jeff has also authored over 100 articles, including Expressive Voting and Electoral Equilibrium, which won the 1999 Duncan Black Memorial Prize for the best article in public choice, and the article Is There a Duty to Vote?, which won the 2000-2001 Gregory Kafka Prize for the best article in political philosophy. I take it it's not a question about a legal duty in Australia. It'll be a short article. In today's talk, he turns his attention to the lessons public choice theory and the expressive account of voting have for our efforts to respond to climate change. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Brennan.
Thank you. Well, I should explain that I am an economist. I've just fallen into bad company over the years, and so I've strayed into, sort of bits of philosophy and bits of economics, bits of political science rather. But as I exist in, I should confess now that because of administrative changes at the ANU, I'm now back into the philosophy department in the Research School of Social Sciences at the ANU, which means that my life is one of continual bluff on every possible margin, which suits me fine. I wanted to begin, before I start my talk, by saying just a little bit about why climate change is such a terrific topic for PPE purposes, because it does bring together a vast number of different issues that are interesting to philosophers and economists and political scientists. And, just when you think through the sorts of, I'm sure you've done this already, in this series had papers on all sorts of dimensions that connect with various of the things that seem to me to be important, but all sorts of salient issues that crop up. First of all, is a timing issue. Most of the effects of policy undertaken now will be exhibited in 50, 100 years, and there's an issue of how one should discount the future, an issue on which political scientists haven't said much, but certainly philosophers and economists have said a lot, often at cross purposes and often apparently different things. So, in general, for philosophers, the idea of discounting the future pains is ethically outrageous, whereas for economists it's routine and totally to be expected and so on. As I say, I think there's a lot of talking of cross purposes at stake in that apparent confrontation, but it's interesting to try and sort out the issues. And of course, one of the central things in the whole carbon emissions, global climate change debate is how one should deal with apparently small risks. I mean, that's how big or small they are is by necessity a matter of conjecture, of very catastrophic outcomes. And there's an ethics and an economics in a way associated with those kinds of issues and putting those together is an interesting issue. And then there's of course a difference in the ethics, the sort of approach that philosophers might routinely make to these issues might be through the lens of rights violations, to see increasing carbon emissions as invoking, where there wasn't before, a whole set of effective rights violations. Individuals do have a right to an environment of a certain quality, which carbon emissions impinge on, versus the sort of general utilitarian approach that economists, quasi-utilitarian approach that economists take, and that seems to dominate most of the policy debate, in which the issue is, well, look, basically we take the status quo as being emission levels in 1990, and then we ask how we can get back to that, imposing, sort of, as it were, requirements on different countries to get back to whatever their emission levels were in 1990, or whenever the benchmark year is, as getting back to 350 particles per million, roughly, or 400, or 450. That's also part of the debate. And then there's an issue about the authority of individual preference. To what extent should preferences for environmental amenity count or not count? To what extent should the environment stand as a moral claimant in its own right? Those are questions on which certainly economists and philosophers have tended to take rather different views, with economists enthusiasts for outcomes that reflect individual preferences, and philosophers find that kind of more or less incomprehensible. So that's interesting. And then there's the whole issue about scientific dispute. Within an epistemic division of labour, how much authority should lie with the scientists? Is there a bias? Are there incentive problems in the promotion of particular views as against other views, and does that really distort popular understandings of how large these problems are? There's clearly some disagreement among the scientists, though even how much agreement and disagreement there is itself a matter of contention. And what is a simple economist or philosopher or lawyer or political scientist to make of that alleged disagreement or alleged consensus? What scientific assumptions are we to make? And that's an interesting question, I think, an interesting question from the various points of view of economics and philosophy, but it's also an interesting political question, because if popular perceptions are themselves a function of the institutional structure in which we operate, or indeed even if they're brute facts, if the population at large is grossly underinformed about these issues, a matter that economists are inclined to think they will be for predictable reasons anyway, then, how does politics work, and should the outcomes of democratic politics, when the stakes apparently are so high, really trump what the experts believe ought to be done? Supposing that we've got enough consensus among enough of the scientists that something indeed ought to be done. So I think, it's tremendously rich kind of example to deploy in exposing all sorts of really, really interesting questions which we PPE people think can't be left to the resources of anyone. discipline. But I do need to say, before I begin to say something about the particular things I'm going to talk about today, which are about the politics of the global warming thing from a rational actor political theory sort of point of view, I do need to say something about the science. And so all I'm going to say on that front is that I'm making two assumptions about this. One is that, of course, we do not know what the effects of concentrations of 450 particles per million, 500 particles per million will be. We do know that we're on a trajectory to achieve those levels within a certain period. Again, a matter of contention, but say 30 or 40 years, if nothing else is done. And I believe that there is a consensus among the scientists that there's a non-negligible probability, that's all I need to claim, that the effects could be catastrophic. They're almost certainly going to have some effect, so I think a majority of scientists believe, and I'm going to take that consensus as given. So I'm not going to dispute on what sort of grounds could I dispute what the science seems to be saying, accepting that it's highly conjectural. You know, it does seem to me still that the nature of the problem is such that the scientists are saying there's a significant probability that there will be quite bad results, and a non-negligible probability, maybe only 2 or 3%, maybe higher than that, that there will be really serious quasi-catastrophic events. And, you know, some possibility, you know, that would be ridiculous to put a percentage on it, I think, that very large numbers of people will be killed and that the planet will be uninhabitable for significant forms of forms of life and numbers of people. And that's what I'm kind of more or less assuming. I think there's a real issue here. I'm taking it for granted in what I will say today, that there is such an issue. Okay. Accepting that, you know, at some level, of course, this is a scientific problem, it's interesting to me, you know, when I run around in my interdisciplinary circles as I do, that disciplines tend to own problems. You know, this is a bit of a version of the aphorism that to every man who has a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, there are just a number of hammers here, different hammers, and philosophers think this is essentially a moral problem. And the economists say, no, it's really an economic problem. And I was going to suggest, you know, in that spirit that, well, it seems to me it's really a political problem. Okay, or at least what I want to do today is to focus on the politics using the repertoire of concepts and techniques that I, as a rational choice political scientist of a slightly revisionist form, as you'll see, can bring to bear to these questions. And I hope I won't talk for very long, actually, so leave lots of time. The first thing I want to say is that, you know, anyone coming to the global emissions issue from a public economics point of view immediately identifies this as a global public goods problem. Okay? That is, you conceptualise the issue as creating, as it were, an end person, prisoner's dilemma, where the end persons at stake are all people in the world. And normally, in that tradition, the existence of public goods problems, certainly the existence of large number of public goods problems, at the national level, have been taken to generate a case for collective action. So the rationale for the productive state, as we might call it, the rationale for government intervention in the provision of various goods and services, defence and lighthouse services and what have you, the normative rationale that economists have given has traditionally rested on identifying the problem as a public goods problem. And I think, though this is of course an issue of contestation, like most, that, the idea of the protective state too, the diagnosis of the Hobbesian problem in this tradition tends to be as a prisoner's dilemma interaction. So specifically, agents have an incentive, rationally, to free ride. And the exercise of institutional design in this sort of environment is to reconstitute the relations between agents so that their incentives are not to free ride and government action, collective decision making, explicit collective decision making is seen as a possible way of doing that. That, I take it, is the standard sort of analysis. And it's important to recognise that in the absence of collective government action, there will be a significant failure, okay, normative failure. That is, you won't be able to solve the free rider problem with any great confidence. Now, if that's true, then what that means is that what happened in Copenhagen is utterly predictable. That is, that because we don't have world government, because we don't have a mechanism for explicit quasi-coercive enforcement of nations to contribute to a solution to the public goods problem, then there's going to be, this really is a major problem. And in fact, it's this fact that I take it, people like Nick Stern and all the other economistic commentators on the carbon emissions problem, it's this that makes the carbon emissions problem a really serious problem, a problem that we may not be able to solve. Okay, that is, in the absence, that is, of effective world government. Okay? Now, you might say, obviously this is, if it's true, it's an important fact, right? That this may be a problem that we simply can't solve. It's very interesting to me that what happens in the Stern report and related documents is that they begin by saying, look, this is a very serious problem and it is a global public goods problem and it will require somehow binding agreements among all the countries in the world, or a significant large number of the significant players, if the problem is going to be solved. And of course, if you could make those binding agreements among individuals, in the normal course of events, there wouldn't be a public goods problem, right? So the whole presumption is that this is a really, really major issue. And that's exactly what I think Stern recognises. But then, interestingly, you know, they go on to say that, well, but, you know, this is what would be required, you know, carbon tax of this magnitude, or, you know, talk about, as if this problem could be solved. There's a joke that most people know about economists and on a desert island. You know this story about the assume a can opener story? I've never thought that, it never struck me as being sort of particularly kind of germane to, there are one or two economist jokes that I think are really good, apposite economist jokes, but that one never struck me as being particularly significant. But I must say, in this case, it seems to me it's right on the money. You know, we talk, you know, we say, look, there's this huge institutional problem, namely the incapacity of privately acting agents to internalise, inverted commas, the relevant externalities. And yet, well, we're going to assume that that problem's solved so that we can go on and do our normative analysis about what would be the ideal policy arrangement for. And they'll say things like Stern does, you know, look, if we don't solve this problem, then, you know, it's all a wash. But that doesn't seem to me to be any kind of argument at all, right? You know, to say, if we can't solve this problem, the outcomes will be terrible, isn't a solution to the problem. It's just to say, well, there is this problem, and it's not obvious that upping the stakes is, you know, bears in any way on the nature of the problem. So Copenhagen, Kyoto, these are predictable. The failure of countries to be able to come together and make agreements in the first place, and even if they did make agreements, as the Kyoto case showed, to be able to enforce them is a real problem. And it's a particular problem because it would require, for the United States, for example, to exercise leadership here, you know, it would not only have to sign on to binding, putatively binding international agreements, but it would somehow have to prevent its own business from going off to Europe or Australia or New Zealand or what have you and conducting their carboniferous activities in those places, which it could do, presumably, with appropriate carbon tariffs on products that weren't made within the United States. But, you know, believe me, that would be extraordinarily costly to the United States, and it wouldn't guarantee that the problem would be solved. That's the essence of the prisoner's dilemma. You know, that the contribution which each makes to the total is a fraction of the outcome. So in the neighbourhood of optimality, as it were, you know, the cost that you endure acting unilaterally is very considerably higher than the benefits that you derive. That's just the nature of the problem. So I make this claim about Australia, but you know, I think it goes for more or less for every country if it can be read. If the Australian government faithfully pursued national interest, it wouldn't do anything to reduce its carbon emissions. If it tracked what the national interest was, then reduction policies would go in for amelioration policies of various kinds, but it would not go in for reduction. Now, I say here, because it's an important theme in Richard Tuck's recent book on free riding. Interesting book, that at least in some public goods problems there are thresholds. That is, you know, so, you can see why if there were a threshold, if there were a well-established limit, so if we get over 400 particles per million, then disaster strikes. And if we're under 400, everything's okay, more or less. You can see then how spontaneously you might end up by hovering at 399, because everybody would know that, well, if we produce more than we're currently producing, we've got to stop what we're, try and keep a limit, because if we produce more, then catastrophe will fall. So it presents everybody with a kind of all or nothing choice in each of the players, as it were, faces an all or nothing choice in the provision of the public good. You get the benefits if you provide enough, but you don't get anything if you don't. And you might think, well, the carbon problem is exactly a problem of that kind. The difficulty here is, look, A, we don't know what the threshold is. B, what the scientists tell us is, well, there's a not necessarily linear relationship, but a positive relationship between the level of carbon emissions and ambient air temperatures, sea temperatures, and so on, the climatic effects that go with those. And, there is presumably some choice about, well, can we live with 4 degrees? Can we live with 6 degrees increase? Can we live with 8 degrees increase? And whether you can or not partly depends on where your country's located and what your demand for environmental amenity is, and so on. But the point is that, if there isn't a threshold, if the threshold's just something that's sort of really quasi-invented, then it's not clear that an appeal to the sort of threshold dimensions to public good supply really helps very much. Okay, so I've said that this is a global public goods problem. If Australia and many other countries, all the other countries presumably, were rational, they just accept that this is an unsolvable problem and get on with the business of amelioration. But here are some interesting, really interesting, countervailing facts. We did manage the international agreement on fluorohydrocarbons, pressure packs and so on. This was destroying the ozone layer, we were assured, and they were banned. And the ban seems to have stuck. So that's not anything like the carbon emissions problem, because reducing carbon emissions to 350 particles per million or whatever is regarded as being the safe threshold is a seriously costly business. Not exorbitantly costly, maybe 2%, maybe 5% of GDP. But, if the worst case scenarios are right, then there's a lot more than 5% of GDP potentially on the other side of the ledger, awaiting realisation in 40 or 50 years. In any event, we've done some things, so that suggests it's not totally impossible. Secondly, lots of governments, not I understand Virginia's, but lots of governments are actually taking unilateral action of some kind. So the Australian government is planning to introduce its own carbon emissions policy. It uses the rhetoric of taking a lead and so on and so on. But as I say, and they'll often say, look, something's got to be done or we will lose the barrier reef. Well, the best evidence now is that the barrier reef is a goner anyway within 30 or 40 years. But even if that were not true, it's clearly a non sequitur. Anyone looking at it through the lens of a prisoner's dilemma interaction, sure, lots and lots of very bad things are going to happen, but you can't stop them from happening. Australia are reducing its carbon emissions to 70% or 80% or 90% of what it produces. It's not going to save the barrier reef. That's a function of what everybody else does. But Australia is doing it. The European community is doing it. Even some cities are doing it. They're going green, and they advertise. We put in place these carbon emissions reduction regulations and so on and so on. Yeah, and this looks preposterous, because after all, the effect that even the polluting city of Richmond would have on world carbon emissions is negligible. So why would Richmond introduce unilaterally, at some cost to itself, it does cost things to reduce the carbon emissions, why would they do it? But not Richmond, I know, but some cities are doing this. And so even little villages and so on. So there's a puzzle here, I think. A puzzle that needs explanation. And I want to run quickly through two explanations that are around in the literature of things. Perhaps they don't explicitly stand as explanations, but this is the way the logic would have to go. The first is what I take to be the standard public choice line. Now, the characteristic feature of the standard public choice line, for my purposes, is that politics is seen, like markets are seen, as essentially a scramble of interests. What's going on here is that different groups, different individuals at the ballot box, and different groups at the larger levels of aggregation that are relevant perhaps for lobbying and so on, are really out for, number one, for their interests. They behave in politics essentially the same way that they behave in markets, and after all, why wouldn't they? They're the same people. It seems kind of deeply question-begging, at the very least, to assume that the individual who is essentially a self-interested agent in the marketplace would, as they enter the holy sanctum of the ballot box, become a perfect altruist or something. Yeah, that's question-begging. Why would that occur? I suggest a partial answer to that question in this context, but still, it's a question that needs to be answered. And the standard public choice line has just been to extrapolate from market behaviour to political behaviour, and so it's all the same large social ballgame. And of course, what this enables us to do in any particular case is to enrol what economists have called incidence analysis, which looks at the distributional effects of different policies into the role of explaining, predicting political outcomes. Because if we can identify what the effect of a particular policy will be on the interests of particular players, then we can use that as a mechanism to predict the patterns of political support that will emerge, and we're often we've got basically a predictive explanatory theory of politics. So techniques that were around in public economics that essentially performed a normative role reappear now as explanatory. And what was interesting to me in particular about the arguments in the Australian case, where what was promoted was cap-in-trade carbon emissions quotas. So basically, the idea was you would create a certain number of permits to make carbon dioxide emissions. You would variously auction these off or give them away or what have you, but the crucial feature was that they were to be retradable. So that it didn't matter, the thought was, how you gave them out. Once you've got this retrading mechanism, then the people they would find their hands into the highest value user by virtue of the market mechanism. Markets sort of operate. So that was the idea. There was going to be these tradable emission permits, essentially. The alternative would have been, I hope you don't mind if I take my coat off, it's a little warm. The alternative would have been to have a carbon tax. There is a carbon tax of a certain magnitude which would produce the same output as any specific level of aggregate emissions levels, and it would allocate the costs in such a way that everybody at the margin would face the same price, the same cost of producing a marginal unit of emissions in exactly the same way as the tradable quotas would. And so, one question that arises, well, why not use the tax? Why not use the tax rather than the quotas? The answer, I believe, is that under certain assumptions about the relative political powers of various sort of large groups in the community, a carbon tax would be infeasible, but a set of retradable instruments would not be infeasible. It would be perfectly feasible. And just, everybody who's done first year economics, basic principle, probably microeconomics, would probably have done a little exercise about the incidence of a tax. And that's what this exercise is. So there's the idea is there's a demand for, if you don't do economics, you don't have to worry too much about this because the basic message I think will be clear enough. But there's a demand for carbon emissions. Carbon, just as there's a demand for labour and capital, there's a demand for carbon emissions because carbon emissions are an input into productive processes that produce goods that people want. So there's a sort of, as it were, a derived demand for carbon emissions. There's a cost of producing the carbon emissions. And in the absence of any public intervention, you'd get a level of carbon emissions, which I've called QC here, okay? And what we're going to do is contemplate getting back to Q star. So Australia's going to produce not 300 tonnes per year, but 200 or whatever the relevant measure is. Okay. And if we did this by putting a tax on carbon emissions, okay, so just make carbon emissions more expensive, we could get that, achieve that result by having a tax of amount PD minus PS, or if you want to express it as a rate, the ratio of that distance to that distance, or to that distance to that distance, depending on whether it's a cum price or net of price, net of tax price base. And what we observe is that individuals would be made worse off by this tax. Okay, consumers will lose this dashed red amount plus W. Producers will lose this dashed green amount plus S. We call the division, the proportions in which these individuals pay the tax as the incidence of the tax normally, and we call W plus S the excess burden. You know, this is familiar to all masters of partial equilibrium Marshallian analysis. And what the important point here is just to notice that if we divide the world into these groups, so producers and consumers of goods and consumers of environmental quality, same people, of course, well, producers and consumers, often the same people, but they operate, in these different roles in different proportions. And taxpayers, so we've got 4 groups of people. We just want to keep track of what's going on with these people. Well, when we put on the carbon tax, producers lose a certain amount. Remember this rectangle here? They lose that amount plus S. Consumers lose this red amount plus W. Consumers of the environment gain by the reduction in carbon emissions. Of course, we just a little footnote to the point, most of the consumers of environment live not in Australia, they don't vote in Australia, but they're still consumers and they're relevant for any normative analysis, and taxpayers then gain this amount of revenue, the sum of those two squares. The carbon tax increases tax revenue, and as taxpayers, that can be either used to reduce other taxes or to make other spending. We have not spelling that out. Okay, if we use the emissions standard, then of course there's no tax. Suppose we just give the quotas. We just have a regulation that specifies Q star. Okay, then taxpayers would get no gain and no loss. There'd be no revenue generated. Okay, the consumers of the environment, if we move from QC to Q star, they'll get exactly the same effect. Consumers of goods, well, the market price of this good under a QC, the market clearing price, will be PD. Okay, so they will lose exactly what they did before. But the producers will gain the full amount of the tax revenue equivalent. Okay, because they'll be able to produce these goods at price PS, and they'll be able to sell them at price PD. Okay. So, what the effect of introducing these carbon quotas is, effectively, is to make a transfer equal to the tax equivalent to producers. That's what it does. And so, the standard sort of story would, the standard public choice story, interest-based story, would say, okay, I can explain both the form of the policy, namely the emissions quotas, and the fact of the policy, namely there'll be emissions quotas, most of which will be given away free to firms. Okay. Clearly, if what the government did was auction off all the emissions, then the tax and the quotas would be identical, because the firms would have to buy these emission quotas. But it was always absolutely clear that some proportion of these emissions quotas were going to be given to producers particularly producers of especially carboniferous stuff, because they would otherwise, under a tax, they would bear a disproportionate burden. So we can explain the form of the policy and the fact of the policy, the fact that the policy exists at all, by virtue of the transfers that this policy enables, on the assumption that producers have a lot of political power and taxpayers don't have very much. So that's the way in which the sort of conventional public choice story would go. Now, I think that is at best a partial story. It might help to explain, I think it does, help to explain something of what's going on in buying off business interests. So in a way, in dealing with the elite, I think as far as the form of the policy is concerned, I think it was very important for the Australian government, if it wanted to get this policy up, to put it up in this form rather than in the form of a carbon tax. I think that much is clear. But I don't think that's all that's entailed. I think that there is a substantial political pressure from the general electorate, a substantial amount of popular opinion in favour of carbon taxes or emissions, in favour of doing something about carbon emissions, not based on self-interest, but based on their values and opinions and so on. And the challenge then is to say, well, why is it the case that what voters do at the ballot box is actually different from what they do in the marketplace? Why isn't politics just a matter of interests? And that's the story that the expressive theory of voting attempts to tell. And I think it's the right theory of voting, incidentally. I think this is the theory of voting that follows from the axioms, as it were, of rational behaviour. Namely, that rational individuals, will not behave at the ballot box in the same way that they behave in markets, that they will behave in general more morally at the ballot box than they will in markets, in the sense that moral considerations will play a much larger role in what they do. And I want to just explain why, and then to sort of gesture at why the environment and the interests of the environment and so on might well play a role as one of the elements in people's appropriately sensitive moral consciousness. Okay, the expressive account of voting begins with the fact, I take it is a fact, of individual non-decisiveness. Okay, the idea is that when I'm confronted with a choice between these keys and this bottle of juice, no, it's not juice, it's water. Bottle of water in the marketplace, I choose the keys. And what that tells you is the expected utility, or whatever you like to, however exactly you like to phrase it, my preferences are such, my desires are such, that I prefer the keys to the bottle. The opportunity cost of the keys chosen is the bottle foregone. But when I do the same thing at the ballot box, the opportunity cost of my voting for the keys is not the bottle of water foregone at all. It's a vote for the bottle of water foregone. Whether I get the keys or the bottle of water depends on what everybody else does. Okay? So my action is detached from the outcome that I endure in a way that's sort of highly similar to the way in which my action is detached from the outcome in the prisoner's dilemma problem. Right? Just as my reducing my carbon emissions does not save the barrier reef, okay, because my action and the desired outcome is, as it were, separated. I'm individually not causally efficacious in bringing about the thing about which I care. So in the ballot box, okay, the expectation is that when I choose to vote for the keys, whether I get the water or not well, that's a function of what everybody else does, except in one case, except in the case where there's an exact tie among all other voters. Then I, and of course all the other voters who voted for the winning candidate, are decisive. Okay? Then we do make a difference. Then we do causally bring about the outcome. So the idea is this, suppose when I went to the ballot box, I just made a mistake. Somehow I got confused and I voted for the candidate that wasn't the candidate I intended to vote for. You might say, well, this is a terrible thing for you to do. But if it is a terrible thing, it's not a terrible thing because it will bring about a change in the outcome. It'll only do that if there's an exact tie among all other people. This is a very, very remote possibility. I mean, there's a debate in the literature about how exactly it should be calculated. The most fashionable forms, I think, make it implausibly small, but for my purposes here, it doesn't matter too much whether it's, an electorate, say, of 130 million in the United States. Was that roughly the number of voters who voted in the most recent presidential election? The probability of there being an exact tie among all other voters, so there's got to be an exact tie among the voters in the marginal district, as it were, that probability is extreme. Believe me, is extremely small. Maybe much smaller than 1 in 125 million.
Except for Florida.
No, because look, even in Florida, right? Even in Florida, okay? If you were a Florida voter and you'd made a mistake when you went to the polls in Florida, it wouldn't have made any difference. It would not have made any difference. You. And since you're the only person who's causally efficacious in bringing about how you vote, okay, then the individual voter, the rational individual voter, confronts what I've elsewhere called the possibility of the voter's dilemma. And I just want to explain the structure of this, because this is not quite the prisoner's dilemma. It's not quite the prisoner's dilemma because there's not strictly a dominant strategy. There's always a possibility, very small possibility, of an exact tie among all other voters. But when you go to vote, there are three, there's a mutually exclusive set, an exhaustive set of possibilities. There'll be a majority for A, there'll be a majority for B, or there'll be a tie. No other thing is possible. And the idea here is, I should say constructed, the idea here is that you have reasons for voting for A over B that aren't connected with your interests. They're not connected with, how you will benefit if A or B emerges as the victor. They're reasons that you like A in and of itself. Okay, so you want to express support for A in and of itself. Maybe because it's an identity thing, maybe because there's an impulse that you have. If that's the case, and if that impulse goes against your interests, then if the probability of a tie is small enough, then there'll be, as it were, a quasi-dominant strategy here. Each will vote for A, 5 is greater than 0, 105 is greater than 100. Okay, so each will be led by, as we say, an invisible hand to vote for A, invisible foot in this case, even though they'd all be better off if B were the outcome. If there was a majority for B, they'd get 100 more. But they don't determine whether there's a majority for B, except in this very remote case where there's a tie. Otherwise, there's reason to go for what I call your expressive preferences. One way of thinking about this is like this. if you think of a spectrum of decisiveness, I could write this down. If you think of a spectrum of decisiveness, going from there, and here are your totally decisive. This is the market choice. Not all market choices are totally decisive, of course, so we'll put them in there. But generally, you know, when I choose this, that's what I get. Think of something way out here where you're not decisive at all. Say, a football match. You go to a football match. You care about who wins. You express that caring. You cheer when your team does well and you boo the other opposition if you're uncharitable, and so on and so on. But you don't think, perhaps you do, but you shouldn't think that your individual cheering, if only you could cheer a little louder, that would bring about the desired outcome. I mean, I've seen my son cheer and boo in front of a television set, watching the, you know, it's just a spontaneous action that we have, you know. You have desires about outcomes, about states of the world, you have attitudes about them, and you express those attitudes. Okay? The important thing is to not confuse the attitudes you have and the expression of the attitudes you have with bringing about an outcome which is in accord with your interests. That's, if you think of the tension as it were, as we might put it, between interests and attitudes, interests play a very heavy role at this end of the spectrum and a very little role at that end of the spectrum. Attitudes play a relatively heavy role at this end of the spectrum and a lesser role at the market choice end of the spectrum. So this is like a relative price story, if you like. As you move from the market to the ballot box, the relative price between expressive and interest-based or instrumental considerations changes. Okay? And it changes spectacularly, because whereas in the marketplace you more or less decisive, in the ballot box you're more or less inconsequential. So I say this is more like cheering than choosing. And then the question is, well, what do people cheer for? You know, we have to fill in the content, give this any predictive content, you know, rather than just sort of making a logical point. Give this predictive content, we've got to say something about the content of expressive preferences. What is it that people will cheer for? Well, here's a speculation, right? There's a wonderful scene in Superman the First, where Lois Lane asks Christopher Reeve, you know, what makes you tick? And he looks into the middle of justice, into the middle distance rather, and he says, I believe in truth, justice, and the American way. And you know, you feel like getting up out of your seat and cheering, hey, you know, yeah, truth, justice. Well, the American way may be more ambiguous, but truth and justice, they seem unexceptional enough. Okay? The thing is that the things that you're likely to cheer for are the good things, right? And so one way of sort of thinking about this particular, the voter's dilemma, is to think in these terms. Suppose there's a policy that if it's implemented will cost you $2,000 a year in increased taxes. But it's something that you think this policy would be really good. I mean, it's something that your conscience tells you. The invisible man within the breast, the impartial spectator within the breast, the man within the breast, as Adam Smith would put it, tells you this is something that is approvable, that you should do, that should be done. Question: how much does it cost you to vote according to the dictates of the man in the breast? Public choice theorists have said, well, cost you the $2,000 a year that you'd have to pay if the policy were implemented. Wrong. It costs you $2,000 a year that you'd have to pay if the policy were implemented, times the probability of being decisive. Okay? That's a very tiny sum. In the ballot box, it's so cheap to act according to your conscience that the cost of acting according to your conscience almost doesn't come into your calculus. If it does come into your calculus, it comes into your calculus as an expressive element. You know, taxes are too high, you know, this is bad for the economy, you know, generalised things which might induce you to cheer or boo, rather than what's on the table for you. If you were fully rational. If you were fully rational. And what does this mean for climate emissions? Well, what it means is that to the extent that the environment is the new religion for many people, to the extent that, you know, cheering for the preservation of nature as we know it is something that, you know, engages our responsive attitudes, it's entirely rational for people to go along and cheer for such policies, even though it wouldn't, when you add up the value of the environmental benefit that's derived and, you know, do the calculations, it wouldn't justify your action from an interested point of view. It wouldn't justify not only your individual action, but it wouldn't justify the national action. The policy isn't sort of, from the point of view of the national community, isn't a collectively rational policy. But because there's a gap between what's rational and what, you know, what maximally beneficial, as it were, to the individual, and therefore for the collection of all Australians, and what they will do at the ballot box, okay, then there's a substantial political constituency in favour of environmental policies. And I think this is a very important feature of democracy. I think it's, you know, if we want to understand democracy, you know, you've really got to understand what it is that people do when they vote. And if this story is wrong, you know, then that's important. But I think it's the right story. I think it tells you what it is that individuals would do if they are or were fully rational. Now, of course, we know that, although economists routinely assume that people are fully rational, that that's probably not right. At least they are very likely to have false beliefs about how influential their votes are, and so on and so on. I accept that, all that. But still, you know, even accepting all the sort of psychological caveats and so on, it seems that there's enough truth in the idea that individual agents are rational for us to believe, to be able to predict that their behaviour at the ballot box will be different from their behaviour in the marketplace. And specifically, different to highly significant, redolent, symbolically redolent things of which the environment is one. So I think the reason why, you know, Canberra or Whittyville or whatever it happens to be has votes for, you know, green policies for Whittyville is to be explained in this simple way. You know, it may not be collectively rational for Whittyville, but there's a significant, I just take it, political constituency in Whittyville who will cheer for policies of this kind. Okay? And so the Green Mayor gets elected and implements the Green policies. Note, though, that this isn't the end of the story, because for any rational politician, the rational politician has a whole range of symbolic things that they can do, and voters have a whole range of symbolic things that mobilise their symbolic. GDP loss can have a highly symbolic. It's not so much that I do a careful calculation. Well, if GDP goes down, I'm likely to lose or anything like that. It's not so much that, so much as it is, well, GDP is a sort of index of how well the economy is doing, and if these guys are not doing a good job, then GDP goes down. So it's not at all uncommon for politicians at one and the same time to say, as they were routinely saying in Australia a year ago, we must clean up the environment, we've got to do something about carbon emissions, we've got to do something about gasoline prices, they're getting way too high, we've got to reduce them, we've got a policy task force looking at gasoline prices, we've got this big operation going on. That happens in politics all the time, it seems to me. And it's partly a function of there being multiple constituencies, but it's also the fact that, well, we have pro-attitudes towards low gasoline prices and pro-attitudes towards environmental cleanliness, and politics is designed to cater to both of these. So my anxiety is, sure, I think we will get a certain amount of action on the environmental front, but of course symbolic politics is highly hospitable to tokenism. And when it comes to the crunch, when the rubber hits the road, as we say, and what politicians realise is, look, wait a minute, these policies are going to cost us 3% of GDP, then all of a sudden, they're not going to say, look, we've given up on the environment, but they are going to say, look, there are these terrible costs and so on and so on, and environmental policies will just, they'll be moderated in their severity, there'll be a lot of sort of working around them at the edges and so on, fudging the targets, and that in 50 years, when my grandchildren's children are thinking of having children, the environment's going to be a real, if the science is right, a real problem. Life will be miserable for them, much more miserable than it's been for us. And I think that's what we can reasonably expect. End of talk.
Would you like to field?
Yeah, absolutely.